Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network. We wanted to pull away a little bit from the testimony that's given by Kevin Scott in the George Burch case, as he is going through some testimony regarding the DNA. While they're going through some of that background testimony, I do want to bring in our guest today, who is Adam Sostrin. Adam, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. How are you?
Hello, hello. Always a pleasure to be with you, Sana.
Same here, same here. So we're here to talk about the George Burch case today. We just left the courtroom with the DNA analyst. I guess they want to bring that information in only because there was a lot of DNA that was found on Ms. Vanderheer, on her body, excuse me. So let's talk a little bit about how important the DNA is. Why is the DNA so important? Tell our viewers why.
Well, it's important because it shows that the suspect was with the defendant was with the victim. His DNA was on her body, and his DNA was on the, let's see, it was on the item used for the alleged strangling. It was on her body. How could it not be him? So it is kind of critical to get the DNA evidence.
Right. So the DNA evidence, it could go both ways in this case, because we do know George Burch did admit to the fact that he was with her that night, and that they did have sex in his vehicle that night. So that helps him in one case, but on the other hand, it helps the prosecution as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, of course it does. And of course, the prosecution is going to say that this is a convenient argument. It's so interesting. One interesting component of the defense's case is, well, maybe it is possible that he was having sexual relations with the victim in this case. She meets somebody outside of a bar. According to the Fitbit, he seemed to be or his cell phone, he seemed to be at the home as well. Close to where the body was found. All these things sort of indicate, well, maybe there was some kind of relation that happened. So it is helpful for the defense. And like you said, it's also helpful for the prosecution. But it's interesting how the killer finds her at a bar and then afterwards is at the residence. I mean, does that show something that's consensual? It seems that it could go that way.
Right, but I mean, in this case, the DNA evidence, that's really not going to tell us whether or not it was consensual or not. But another thing that I want to bring up is the fact that George Burch's DNA was found on her body. And if it's to his defense, he stated that, or the defense is trying to bring out the fact that Dietrich was also there. So if it goes into, if the defense is the way that it's going to go, is that Dietrich is the one that actually committed the murder, wouldn't some of his DNA been found in that area as well, or on her body?
You would assume so.
Right.
And that, of course, is something that's an argument that's going to have to be made, and that's an argument that's going to be brought up during closing. You would assume all of those things, of course.
Right. And, that's something that I guess is something for all of us to look to, and this is something that the jurors are going to have to highly consider. They're going to have to look at everything that's surrounding this case, and really determine whether or not the fact that the DNA evidence was on Nicole's body, whether or not it leads to the fact that George Burch actually committed this crime. Another thing that I do want to talk about a little bit is the fact that Dietrich was one of the first people who was considered a person of interest in this case. Talk to us a little bit about that, because we do know that they got into a fight prior to her unfortunate death. Do you think that the investigators may have jumped the gun a little bit in letting him go, and now they just have to move forward with who they have?
Well, I guess they were moving forward based on the evidence that they found. Usually you go after it seems to be, at least you go after the spouse, the boyfriend, the ex. And that's exactly what occurred here. They kept him in custody, I think, 21 or 23 days, and then they released him after that because they didn't think that there was sufficient evidence. But of course, if I'm the defense attorney handling this case, precisely because he was arrested and he was a person of interest in the beginning, I'm going to put it all on Dietrich. And I'm also going to say that, perhaps, my client will say, well, no, this was some sort of consensual thing. And it all sort of it all gels. This is the person that you initially arrested. That's certainly something I would say to the jury. This is a person, why is he at a bar and then why is he at her home? I mean, don't these things indicate something that happened that was consensual? These are all things that I would raise if I were the defense attorney. It seems like these are natural arguments, and I actually wouldn't expect anything less unless the defendant didn't have a theory or a story about him having sex with the victim before the murder.
Well, being the fact that he was there, everything just seems mighty convenient, but you're bringing in some great reasonable doubt. We're going to take our viewers back into the courtroom where you can see some more testimony from Kevin Scott, the DNA analyst.
And what are those?
There were several items.
Can you talk a little bit about the crime lab's policy in terms of receiving items and testing items? Can an agency, for example, just simply send every item they have that might have evidentiary value and ask you to test all of it?
Not necessarily, no. In order to limit the number of items that the lab takes in, just as part of a resource management perspective, we have a set of submission guidelines that we ask agencies to follow. In homicide cases, we would ask the agency, the submitting agency being the Sheriff's Department, to limit their first submission of evidence to 10 items. At the conclusion of the analysis on those 10 items, they would be free to continue to submit more items and so on.
And in a more serious case, in a homicide case, are you often in contact with the law enforcement agency regarding the items that would be sent?
Yes, that's correct. If we know that the law enforcement agency has a large number of items, we might be in contact with them in order to determine which items might be the most probative or the most relevant to the case. So we could start with those first.
And determining what you test is not just based on resources, but also based on the potential evidentiary value of the items and strategical concerns.
That's correct, yes.
Strategical meaning that it would be important to prioritize the items that might have the most value.
That's correct.
Do you know how many reports you generated in this particular case?
Yes, I believe it was 9 reports.
Do you recall how many total items of evidence that you tested in this case?
If my count was correct, I tested 78 items of evidence and 13 standards.
And over what time period?
Most of the testing was performed over the summer of 2016. There were additional 5 items that were recently tested.
In comparison to the average case at the crime lab, is 78 items a lot of items?
I would say that would be a lot of items, yes.
Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network. It seems as if we're taking a break in the courtroom, so we're going to get back to talking with Adam today regarding this case, regarding Wisconsin versus George Burch. George Burch is being charged with first-degree murder in the murder of Nicole Vendenhagen. I'm sorry, I mispronounced her name. Adam, thank you so much again for being with us today. We're still here talking to, we're still here looking at the testimony from Kevin Scott. Kevin was just talking about the items that were recovered from George Burch's home, and he was talking about whether or not DNA or blood was found on some of the items. How important do you think is going through all of this? I could say monotonous testimony for the members of the jury, even though pretty much everything that they're going through, there was no blood or DNA found. Why is that so important?
Well, I think the idea being that they're trying to maybe perhaps rule out, locations where the alleged murder, where the murder had occurred. That's probably the relevance of it.
Do you think that it's relevant for members of the jury to determine that the prosecution here in this case did their due diligence in going through all the items just to determine whether or not there was any DNA found or any blood found on any of George Burch's clothing items or shoes in this case?
Well, I think it's important to show that the prosecution did as diligent did its duty as far as determining who was the culprit in this case, did its homework. You're not going to find blood evidence on or DNA evidence on every single item. It's important to show the things that they did and things that they had inspected, especially, the fact being that they had, according to the prosecution at least, they had arrested the wrong person for a few weeks. So it's important to show what they had to do in the case, what they weren't able to find, but what they did find.
And so we do know that these, most of these items were apprehended after a search warrant was done in George Burch's home. But I think that's something that's important that the defense brought out previously when they were cross-examining Sergeant Jody Beater, I believe his name is the fact that there were two people living in the home. So doesn't that present some type of reasonable doubt? Because anybody could have been wearing those shoes. Am I correct?
That's correct. Anyone could have been wearing those kinds of shoes, but I think that the main thing that the prosecution has is the cord that was discovered. Indeed had the defendant's DNA on. How do you get around that? Why would he have touched that item?
Why would the defendant have touched the item? Say that
allegedly.
Again?
The cord allegedly used to strangle the victim.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're not there yet. I think that's going to be, obviously, that's going to be a great thing for the prosecution to bring out.
Right.
But the fact that they're going through...
Sorry, I jump ahead. I get so excited about the facts of the case as we're talking about it, Stephanie. So I just keep jumping in.
Oh, no, that's not a problem at all. I just kind of wanted to concentrate on what we're seeing right now in the courtroom, or what previously just happened, is the fact that they were talking about these Jordans. They've stayed on these Jordans for a while. We know that pictures of the Jordans were admitted into evidence, and I'm just trying to understand why the prosecution feels it's important to bring out this evidence even though there was nothing found. Doesn't that help the defense out a little bit?
I think of course the defense can say, hey, well, you didn't find anything here, so then there's nothing, so that's more helpful to our defendant. But at the same time, the fact that the prosecution sort of shows a piecemeal, protracted process in order to determine, what was necessary for its investigation into this murder, I don't think that's necessarily a terrible thing.
So essentially, they're just kind of bridging any gaps that the jurors may have, so that they can't say that there's any reason with that. I have to agree with you there. Let's move on. What we're going to do now is we're going to play a clip from Detective Brian Slinger, which was played earlier this morning. So we're going to take a look at this clip, and then we'll talk about it a little bit when we get back.
And luminol, you get a blue color?
Yes, so luminol is applied to, it's sprayed on the surfaces of the interior in the vehicle for this case, and you do it in the dark. And in the presence of blood, you will see a luminescence or a blue glow from the positive reaction.
And with respect to the vehicle, then, your entire search of the vehicle, did the luminol show any indicators of the presence of blood?
There were positive or luminescence or reactions that were observed, but those areas were then marked and then followed up with the phenolphthalein presumptive test for blood, just to test the stain further to see if they were positive or negative.
And what was the result?
I tested 3 additional stains which were negative.
So is there anything of evidentiary value detected and observed after your very thorough examination?
I did not test or did not locate any items that tested positive or presumptively positive for the presence of blood.
So there was nothing of evidentiary value, is that correct?
Correct.
They don't talk about the trunk. They just... We would ask Exhibit 88 be admitted into evidence, please.
Subject to cross, any objection to 88, Ms. Hoffmeyer's report? 88 is received.
I apologize. I think I might have missed a step. I'm going to ask you to identify Exhibit 88, and I'm sorry about that. Do you recognize that document?
Yes, I do.
And when did that?
State Exhibit number 88 is the laboratory report that I generated for this case, laboratory case number W16-1387, and I recognize this by my signature on the report.
Thank you. And your report is dated June 13th, 2016?
Yes, it is.
Did you also apply a case number to this assignment for the Wisconsin Crime Lab?
Yes.
And what was the crime lab number?
Laboratory case number W16-1387.
And you also have reflected on that report the Brown County Law Enforcement Agency report number?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
The agency case number is 16-20716.
Okay, thank you. And again, you were the actual author of the report, is that correct?
Yes, I was.
Thank you. Now I would ask that it be admitted into evidence.
And that is the same report you referenced earlier in your testimony?
Yes, it is.
What you just saw was testimony from Katie Hoffmeyer, actually, who is a forensic scientist in the Wisconsin versus George Burch case. What we do know is that Katie, who is a forensic scientist, did present some testimony in regards to possibly any blood that was found either in the vehicle or other areas. We know that she did testify that there was no blood found in the vehicle, even though they had initially thought that the swabs that were collected, all stains were negative for the presence of blood. We still have Adam here with us. Adam, are you still here with us this afternoon?
Of course, I'll never leave you guys. I'm here.
We appreciate that. So, Adam, we just heard the clip from Katie Hoffmeyer, who is a forensic scientist, and it's pretty much the same thing that we were talking about earlier in regards to DNA. We do know that the prosecution brought her in to discuss whether or not any blood stains were found, presumably in the vehicle. Why would that have been so important to find any blood stains in George Burch's vehicle?
Well, I mean, if they were to find blood stains in George Burch's vehicle, it would show that that George Burch perhaps committed the crime or committed the crime in his vehicle.
Right.
The fact that no blood stains are located there, it goes against those two things.
Right. Well, I mean, doesn't it kind of go against all of what the defense will argue, inevitably? The fact that he was knocked unconscious, wouldn't we expect to maybe find some traces of maybe his blood? Or the fact that she was killed, wouldn't we find some traces of her blood in the vehicle as well? Doesn't that lead to the fact that maybe the vehicle was cleaned a little bit? What do you think?
You would assume so. You would assume all of those things. It certainly doesn't show necessarily that there was an altercation. It doesn't necessarily show that there wasn't an altercation. The fact that he had been knocked down doesn't mean that there's going to be any blood or anything of that kind. So those are still going to be outstanding questions, I suppose.
Yeah, well, one of the things that really came down in the crux of this case, which is getting so much media attention, is the fact that a Fitbit was going to be used to, I guess, presumably, help to convict George Burch. Now, we do know that the judge here in this case, he allowed the use of the Fitbit without an expert. And this was a real blow for the defense. Why do you think an expert would have been needed in this case, coming from a defense perspective?
Well, I certainly wouldn't want that evidence coming in against my client, and I would do everything I could to argue against it from coming in. And the fact of the matter is, when you're having certain technologies that are being presented in front of a jury, you would want an expert to be able to properly lay the foundation of those technologies in order to introduce that evidence. I mean, that would certainly be the argument that any defense attorney would make.
Okay, and I have to agree with you there, even as a former prosecutor, because think about it. We do know that we bring in experts when we talk about cell phone towers and cell phones. So why wouldn't we have an expert talking about a Fitbit? I think that it was a reasonable explanation done by the judge. His explanations were reasonable, but the fact that they are counting, that the Fitbits is used to count the steps of Dietrich in this matter, I think that an expert would have been reasonable to have take the stand, don't you think?
I think so, too. It really does surprise me that could come in without the testimony of an expert. I would expect most judges, at least, would demand something like that from the prosecution before that was introduced.
Great. And so what we're going to do is now we're actually going to get to the clip of Detective Brian Slinger, and we're going to talk about his testimony when we get back.
Okay.
Directing your attention to May of 2016, did you become involved in an investigation into the death of Nicole Vanderheiden?
I did.
And what was your role initially in that investigation?
Initially, I was contacted on Saturday, May 21st, to come in for a body that was found in the field. I was unable to come in that day due to another engagement that I had. There was the Cellcom Marathon was that weekend, and I had some obligations to do with that. So I wasn't able to come in and assist until the following morning on Sunday when the marathon was over. So I believe I got there sometime around 10, 11 o'clock in the morning on Sunday the 22nd.
Judge, may we approach just briefly before the testimony?
Sure, come right ahead. Hey, we just had a brief sidebar just to discuss the extent of the examination, so we're all on the same page and we can continue.
I believe we left off on May 22nd.
Correct. I was called in on that morning on the 22nd.
And on that, and on that date, what duties did you perform?
I responded to the sheriff's office, met with Lieutenant Valley and Captain Conrath at the time, was advised of the situation, kind of brought up to speed on everything. I reported out to the field where the body was located. It had already been removed. I assisted in coordinating a grid search of the area with other officers and other investigators that were out there to try and find any items that we may have deemed of evidentiary value at that time.
Where did that grid search occur?
We started at pretty much right where the body was located, and then moved to the east, and then also to the west towards where the entry road was that we've all seen on the pictures, and then we kind of moved to the south where that large mound was into the field.
Were you the only investigator participating in that search?
No, there was, I can't tell you how many, but there was a large number of us that were kind of doing a grid search where, kind of explained earlier, you walk side to side in arm's length of each other to try and check the area to see if anything would catch your eye.
What sort of items are you looking for at that point?
Well, at that time I had information that it was a blunt force trauma. Sergeant Lopnow and I had been in communications. He was down with the crime lab and he had witnessed the body. So we were looking for any sort of items that may have caused that damage. Like stated earlier, there's a lot of rocks and a lot of things like that in the field that could potentially have been used. So we were looking through those rocks to see if there may have been any blood or any other sorts of evidence on any of those rocks.
And did you find anything of evidentiary value during that search?
We did not.
And again, this was on May 22nd, correct?
Correct, on Sunday.
Do you recall approximately what time?
Sometime later in the morning, closer to noon, possibly. I don't recall the exact time. I know I went over there once the race was over with, so it probably had to be 10, 11, somewhere in that time frame.
And do you recall approximately for how long?
We were a good couple hours. It's obviously, you've seen the pictures. It's a rather large field and a rather large area to try and go through. It's pretty bare, so it wasn't difficult terrain or anything, but we wanted to make sure we did a thorough job.
So apart from the grid search, were you asked to perform any other duties at that time?
So yeah, once the grid search was done, I was advised of this missing person report that was filed the day prior, and that a statement had been taken from Mr. Dietrich advising of the acts that happened on Friday night. So I went and reached out to a bunch of the witnesses that he had advised law enforcement that he was out with to try and get statements from them.
What we just saw was a clip from Detective Brian Slinger, excuse me, and he was talking about that he found the body. We still have Adam here with us. Adam, let me ask you this question. He talks about that there were a lot of people at the scene of where Nicole's body was found, and he said that it was found in an area I believe by the East River, and excuse me. He talks about the fact that in this case where her body was found, we know that the defense is talking about the areas that were not searched around where her body was found. Do you think that helps their case at all, or is this just more so of a red herring?
I think it would be the latter, more of a red herring. And, you know, they're going to tell the jurors don't pay attention to these things. They don't matter. This is where the body was located. These are the items that we found. This was the blood. This was the tie that was used for the neck. I think that's all that's going to happen with that.
Right, but the fact that there was no kind of a search done in the areas surrounding where the body was found. Essentially, that was what was happening during cross-examination earlier today. The fact that the defense really harped on the fact that there was no search done on the East River and the banks where around the area where her body was found. Do you think that that's important, that there was not a search done, especially since it was reported that there was a suspicious man found walking around the area earlier?
Well, of course, they're going to point to things that show that there was shoddy investigation that was done, and it wasn't sufficient. And we don't exactly know where the killing occurred. These are things, of course, that the defense is going to raise, that they have to raise. But I think the mere fact that you have the body, blood, all those things, it's more helpful for the state than it is helpful for the defense. But you're going to have to raise those points.
And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to talk, we're going to go to a clip of Dietrich. And we do know that in this case, Dietrich was the first person who was arrested in connection, as a person of interest in connection to the murder of Nicole. And so his testimony was extremely important. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to his testimony right now, and then we'll talk about it with Adam when we return.
Like I'm showing you, it's been marked as exhibit number 44. Can you identify that photograph?
There's a picture of Nikki and I at the Sandlot, I think during the Steel Panther concert while they were playing, I believe.
I would request that 44 be admitted into evidence and ask for permission to publish that as well.
Subject to recross, any objection to 44?
No, Your Honor.
44 is received, it can be published.
Doug, is the picture on the screen up there, is that the same picture that's in exhibit 44?
Yes, it is.
I should ask, I didn't put this on the record before, the picture that was up on the screen and published for the jury previously, and one of you and Dylan, is that what was depicted in exhibit 43?
Yes, it is.
Doug, you were asked extensively about text messages between you and Nikki. I'm going to show you what's been previously marked as exhibit 41, and I'm going to ask you to reference that. So beginning at numbers 3, 4, 5, and 6, those text messages listed, those are all messages from Nikki which certainly voice her frustration, use some vulgar language toward you and things of that nature.
Yes.
And that's from you to Nikki?
Yes.
And then the next message, number 9, is a response from Nikki to you, and what's that response?
Sure, you still love whores.
And your response to that is in number 10, what is it?
LMAO, ... really, question mark?
And then messages 11 and 12 are again messages from Nikki voicing her frustration. In 13, you respond with what?
And on 13, I said, durr, D-U-R-R-R-R.
What did that mean to you?
Just, I don't know, you're being kind of stupid, silly, I don't know.
And the next text message, number 14, is also from you to Nikki. What is that?
LOL, I'm with Greg at the bar.
And Nikki responded to you?
What bar?
And then she sent a series of messages to you that again were vulgar and demonstrated that she was potentially upset with you, right?
Yes.
And then 19 in particular, I believe you referenced this text message. She sends you a message at about midnight, and what does that message say?
Whatever, sardine can with your so-called friends, but good thing I found someone I know.
So is that the message that you were referring to earlier when you said you believe she ran into a friend?
Yes.
And your response to her in number 20?
Stop, babe. ... I'll be there soon.
We're pulling you away from the clip of Dietrich, which is Nicole's boyfriend at the time, and we are bringing you back into the courtroom because we do know that the jury has been brought back in. And as we provide you with gavel-to-gavel coverage in this case, we do not want you to miss a thing. So we've received word that the jury is back in the courtroom, as you can see here on the screen, and we do still have Adam with us right now. I do know that the judge may be talking to the jury, and we can assume that we're gonna take you back into the courtroom right now.